let's get into some Bulat. What is it? What it do? Where it from? It is hard to find good information on Bulat. I cannot even find the German and Russian papers that we know are out there on the subject on the internet. They're probably buried in some, library somewhere. I'd really have to dig, and I bet I would find something that I couldn't read at the end of that search. So at any rate, this information comes from a paper by Jeffrey Wadsworth and Oleg D. Sherby in 1980 called On the Bulat, Damascus Steel Revisited. So in this publication, Wadsworth and Sherby recount the history of ultra-high carbon crucible steel research in Europe and the attempts there to reproduce the steel. And then they follow P. Anisov, who takes this information for Europe to Russia, and they look at what happened in Russia and then subsequently Germany and the attempts there to reproduce wootz steel. And Ogilvy and Sherby and Wadsworth actually go and produce their own wootz and patterned Damascus or watered silk Damascus out of 1.7% carbon steel, just plain 1.7% carbon steel, after casting it and then rolling it in a certain way to stretch out these carbide plates. And they feel like they were successful without any alloying at producing the watered silk Damascus pattern. So that's sort of what this paper is about. This story begins in the 19th century. Modern metallurgy really has not taken full hold in Europe, and Europe is in the throes of the Napoleonic Wars, and there's this interest in metallurgy and wootz cakes, which are superior to any metal at the time, probably, in most cases, depending on where and how it was made. Again, it was not a homogeneous steel. Its distribution followed the Islamic faith, meaning Europe had very limited exposure to wootz prior to the 17 and 1800s. Wootz was found in Russia, however, in the Middle Ages, where they called it fulad or bulat. Fulad was a Persian word for steel, and people speculate that the steel may have been made in Russia, or it was probably strictly imported from Persia. I think the latter is probably true. It's very interesting to note that in the Ural district of Russia in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were trying to reproduce Bulat by welding non-cemented iron strips with cemented iron strips, which means high carbon. It means steel with iron, basically. And they hammer forged them together, then they bent and re-welded them together in an attempt to duplicate Oriental Damascus. So that, of course, is not the methodology used, but they were doing this 200 years before the Europeans were experimenting with the same thing. And again, I think that has to do with the presence of that steel sort of naturally in Russia, whereas in Europe, specific efforts had to be made to import it. But at any rate, in this paper, Wadsworth and Sherby described the failed efforts of scientists Michael Faraday and a cutler J. Stoddard in the early 1800s to chemically analyze wootz. And these two guys based their work on research done by a guy named Persian and Mouchet decades earlier, who actually concluded correctly that there was a lot of extra carbon in wootz. And for some reason, Faraday and Cutler came to some pretty wonky conclusions about there being silica and aluminum as the main reason that these patterns developed, which was obviously completely false. They published their work, which was translated into French, and Europeans were capitalist by nature, and they wanted to financially gain by an understanding of ultra-high carbon crucible steel, and metallurgical research was being driven as well by the Napoleonic War machine. So France's Société d'Encouragement pour l'Industrie Nationale, which was a group made in France to promote scientific advancement, basically. They handed out awards and money and things like that, but this group announced a special commission to continue Faraday's work under a guy named Jean-Robert Briand, an inspector of assays at the Paris Mint, and he conducted 300-plus experiments on wootz and concluded, much like Mouchet 30 years before him, that it was extra carbon in the wootz that contributed to its damask pattern. One of Briand's contemporaries, a Parisian cutler and knife maker named Cardelac, successfully made a damask blade from Briand steel, allegedly a pretty fine quality one. Briand ultimately describes Damascus steel as a mixture of pure eutectoid steel with layers of what he called the carburetted steel, i.e. cementite, and is thus credited as being the first person to describe accurately the basic composition of wootz in his 1823 publication. So in 1841, Russian Major General P. Anosov, director of the Zlatoust Steelworks in Ural, repeats the work of Faraday and Briand and publishes his own paper on the matter. Much like those before him, he experimented with different exotic alloys like gold and silver and platinum. But he's also one of the first guys to document his attempts to use different clays and graphite crucibles in different parts of the actual manufacture process. He failed many times. And depending on who you read, it said he ultimately produced very high quality blades, able to cut a gauze handkerchief held in midair, for which experiments on English crucible steel could not be made sufficiently sharp to do, and things like this. So it should be noted that in this case, Anosov is not referring to the crucible steel efforts of Briand and some of those people researching wootz, but the blister steel being made part of the Huntsman process and sort of this 1% carbon steel. Basically, he's comparing his ultra-high crucible steel to this 1% cast crucible steel being made in Europe since the 1740s. I have to say, I've read, I think it was Cyril Smith who said basically there's some variable accounts on how successful he was at actually reproducing wootz. Wadsworth and Sherby seem to embrace the fact that he made some high quality stuff. I don't know. His work was almost immediately forgotten because firearms became commonplace over the next few decades. And so, his awesome sword steel just really didn't matter much. A professor, this is years later, in 1860, a professor named D.K. Taranoff visited the Zlatoust mines and rediscovered Anosov's works. And he took findings back to the Obukhov Steelworks in Petrograd. 1868 claims that he was making the best kind of steel ever manufactured. And while lecturing on the topic in 1904, Taranoff inspires a gentleman named Bellew to repeat the work of Anosov as well, and in 1906 this guy published his own paper on crucible steel entitled On the Bulat. Bulat goes on to publish a personal account of the process he uses, in which he takes iron and graphite, combines them, and subsequently forges out at a red-hot spheritization type heat instead of a more traditional hotter white heat or yellow heat temperature. It's very common for these people, apparently, to say the same thing through the years, through the decades, when they're trying to reproduce the ultra-high carbon crucible steel and forge it, and that the yellow hot, white hot temperatures that are typical for the metals of the day in forging is too hot. The ultra-high carbon crucible steel crumbles. On the other hand, if they forge it too cold under a red heat, then it cracks. And so there's appears to be this sweet spot, I guess, what is just around critical temperature, or maybe a little bit under, which is a spheritization temperature, and that's sort of where they want to keep it. In 1924, von K. Hanecker in Solingen, Germany, made a number of blades by this process using 0.7% carbon Swedish steel mixed with a fixed amount of wood. He heated it for 12 to 14 days in a box at 1,000 to 1,100 degrees Celsius, and the carbon content ultimately reaches 1.2 to 1.47%. It's the higher carbon content materials that he takes, cools slowly, forged in quenches from 740 degrees Celsius, tempered at 300 degrees Celsius. And by altering the annealing and tempering cycles, it is said that he produced very high-quality Damascus blades in the early 1920s. So basically, this is the story of Bulat, an ultra-high carbon crucible steel, a steel likely imported and used in Russia in the Middle Ages from Persia, which seems to have inspired some very early attempts there to reproduce it unsuccessfully. After Europe is invigorated with wootz, Briand's groundbreaking work is adopted by P. Anosov in Russia and carried down the line from 1841 to 1924, over 80 years, where it lands in Germany and subsequently informs and inspires Wadsworth and Sherby in 1980 in their own attempts to reproduce wootz, they say successfully.